This presentation is on traumatic events by Olivia Weiberg. I'm going to start off talking about health concerns about traumatic events. First off, social determinants are a big factor that play a role in traumatic events. Some of the main social determinants that I want to talk about are, first off, low income and low economic status. This occurs more often than we realize, and traumatic events can actually be a result from this social determinant. With low income status and economic status in areas in different populations in different cities and states, traumatic events can become more likely, especially in heavier populated areas. Mass shootings, natural disasters, sexual and physical assault, and even war are contributing factors that happen as traumatic events in such areas. Concerns with traumatic events can be psychosocial and how they affect people who have been in traumatic events or who have even caused traumatic events. This can affect them long term, and if they do not have the right treatment and help that they need, then it can have a long-lasting effect on them and even other people around them. And in this article that I found by Lowe in 2017, it talks about the lasting effects of mass shootings and how the media covers them and spreads the coverage so fast that it not only affects the people in the event, but also the public from the lasting effects. It is difficult to not let media get in the way of how it affects people, but the world that we live in today, there's no way around it really. For instance, even as a traumatic event such as a kidnapping, I think we're all very familiar with the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping that happened years ago. And the media has definitely had an impact on that today, even back in the day, but even now more so today. There's even been movies made on it and the situation that it caused. A root cause that is actually associated with these health disparities can really come from these low economic status communities and low income housing. When these kids grow up in houses that do not have the money or resources to get the stabilization that they need, they actually end up falling into that same pattern and same behavior. Some other health concerns as we talk about Maslow's pyramid, the most common traumatic events that we see today would be more like sexual assault, physical assault, mass shootings, and kidnappings. This is where safety comes into play the biggest. Our physical actual needs don't play as big of a role as maybe in natural disasters it would, but as far as these type of traumatic events, the safety is one of the biggest concerns that we see on this Maslow's pyramid. The rest of this pyramid follows very closely behind, and I wanted to touch on the middle section there on love and belonging. The need that we have for love and belonging as humans, we strive for, and it can be one of the root problems as to why traumatic events affect us so much, as to why traumatic events continue to keep happening, and why we see more and more of these cases without much treatment and help. In the research study that was done to find what populations are at more risk for infections and diseases, it came down to the conclusion that a diverse group of characteristics are related to the health effects like life stages, secondary diagnoses, and low social economic statuses, and the populations are at greater risk for diseases and infections. When I talk about sexual assault, that is a very specific traumatic event that can cause the spread of disease and infections such as STDs. For those people that have been involved in traumatic events, this population is at great risk for self-harm, and that it can result in many psychosocial effects, and ones that I talked about earlier. It really impacts mental illness, and if people who have been in traumatic events or who have caused traumatic events do not get the right help that they need, then this horrible cycle just continues. It can have a huge impact on mental health, and the PTSD that can come from it can create, for many people, poses a high risk for self-harm and suicide in this population. War also can play a big role in self-harm due to the cause of PTSD and trauma that they see soldiers in war and the stuff that they have to go through. That can really cause a traumatic effect for them and really affect their mental health. Harm from others is the biggest thing here, though, with traumatic events. The main thing with any of these is usually because it is harm caused by other people. When I talk about mass shootings or school shootings, this is one of the biggest safety issues, and it is completely out of people's control. Students that are in school and who are involved in mass shootings are completely under no control whatsoever and are involved in traumatic events that they did not ask to be in. The sexual and physical assault are also due to traumatic events that are inflicted from other people, which are also out of many people's control. What I want to talk about next is the social economic status and what role that plays. I kind of touched on it at the beginning there as one of the social determinants of health, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more because it plays such a huge role in traumatic events. It is areas like these that do not have the stabilization and resources that they need to live a healthy lifestyle that we see more of these traumatic events, such as the mass shooting, sexual and physical assault, and even kidnapping and much more. Economic stability deals with all of the things that it takes to live a healthy lifestyle, but it all comes back down to money and wealth. In this article and study that was conducted by Osman, there is a view that affects the social economic disadvantage and the effect it has on traumatic life events. The results showed a significant difference in traumatic events for this population. Race and ethnicity are the next that I wanted to talk about. In this article that was also done by Osman, there was this study done on Israeli adults and their traumatic events in comparison with ethnic disparities. Results from this study showed that Arabs and immigrants from the former Soviet Union, FSU, experienced higher rates of functional limitations and limitations in ADLs compared to veteran Jews. The next one I kind of wanted to talk about was to touch on this real quick in conclusion of education, income, and traumatic life events, but it did not eliminate the ethnic disparities in the disability. Also, with religion, this can play a role in traumatic events. I saw religion as more of an effect on the outcomes of traumatic events and how people and communities and families will reach out to religion as more of a safe place and a comfort. I've seen many examples where religion and different religious groups have actually helped as an organization with families and communities when they have been through traumatic events. I've also seen it as a safe place where many people who are seeking help and do not have the many resources to reach out to, they will reach out to their churches and people that they feel is a safe place to go. As far as gender roles go, many would argue that men and women play different roles in traumatic events. When it comes down to sexual and physical assault, there was actually an article written by Sable in 2006 that talks about the difference for men and women in reporting traumatic events. The results ended up showing that both genders dealt with it the same, and both felt shame and guilt and embarrassment, which held both genders back from reporting anything or getting the actual help that they need. I think this is a big thing that we need to touch on to make sure that both genders are being recognized in traumatic events as they happen. There is kind of a stigma for men to have more of a masculinity role and to not be weak or to be seen as one that needs help. But it is equal for both sides when they both can seek help and need to get it. As far as geographic regions go and the effects that it plays in traumatic events, I did some research in different areas in the United States that show levels of poverty. As you can see on this map, there is a different level of poverty that lives throughout the states. And depending on the geographical region, it shows the effects and outcomes that can cause on these populations and traumatic events. And depending on the areas that these people live in, it affects them differently, and it also affects the outcomes depending on how many resources and stuff that they have around them to help them. Some are very limited, and that's why we continue to see this chain. Telehealth does and could play a huge role in places like this that have low income, have no resources for help. If we could be able to reach them with the technology that we have today, it would play a huge role in helping them get better and reach the resources that they need that they normally cannot do so. Implicit biases from this population suffer from being stuck in this type of situation, and it is very hard for this population to get out of. It is kind of not a well-known thing that is very strict and everyone knows about, but due to these situations, it's like the cycle that I talked about. It also proves that there's almost everyone in these type of situations that will end up being the cause of a traumatic event later in their life. As far as the explicit side goes and different biases there, it is a very well-known fact that heavier populated areas are bound to experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. In this article by Benjet in 2016, it showed and reported that over 70% of respondents reported a traumatic event at least once in their life and were exposed to 4 or more. Again, regions here play a big role on traumatic events, but this one talks about the regions that have less influence. As you can see, the USA is highlighted red for having over 70% of the population. It's a high influenced area for traumatic events. But as we look over into China, I was actually surprised to see that this one is a lower percentage, even though they are a heavily populated country. Exposure varied by country, social, demographic, and history of prior traumatic events. And in this research article, it talks about how different regions all over the world are differently exposed to traumatic events. These are my different references on different sources that I looked at for this work. And I think it's very important that we understand that traumatic events happen all over the world, even no matter what region we do live in. Luckily, or fortunately, some regions have more resources than others to be able to reach out and get help, but it is so important that we understand that they still occur and happen everywhere we live, no matter where you are in the world. And it is still a population that we need to, as healthcare workers, be aware of. We don't actually know what patients that we see daily that come in and actually have been through traumatic events and the long-lasting effects that it has had on them. So just to be a little bit more aware of those as we think of our patients and the cares that we give to them daily.